They called the place Harrowgate Ironworks on the maps. Workers used a shorter name that sounded like the cough at the end of a long day. The buildings ran in a line along the river where the current did most of the hauling. When the wind ran down the valley right, you could smell metal that hadn't been hot for 70 years. That was the first thing I noticed. You don't forget that smell once it moves into your head. I didn't go out there cold. I started with the slow work. County minutes on thin paper that stuck together. Union newsletters with runny ink. Accident ledgers that turned my hands gray. The collapse sat in all of it like a tooth that never healed. A roof span went first. The gantry followed it into the slag. Everyone working the night shift on E-line was in the drop zone. The men across the pit swore they saw arms break the surface and then go down again. Nobody pulled anybody out. The pit crusted over while the foreman stood there and tried not to cry. The paperwork turned careful after that. Every time someone wrote about it, they used words that kept the story in a straitjacket. Misadventure, structural defect, force majeure. That last one came up 6 times across 3 different hands. I wrote it down and underlined it. I don't believe in the way that phrase gets used. It lets people pretend the world decided on a thing by itself. I would have left it in the stack with the other factory ghosts if not for the footage. It started as a clip on a channel that does urban exploration. No names, no faces, just hands and boots and breath. Someone mirrored it, then someone else cut it up, boosted the brightness and slowed it. That's the version I watched until my head hurt. Conveyor belts moving in a building without power. A punch press working a stroke without feed lines. Sparks that didn't come from anything copper or steel. A furnace throat that looked dim and then didn't look dim at all. The camera operator never spoke. The other person did. They stayed behind the lens. They had a low voice that wanted to whisper and couldn't quite manage it.
We're not alone.
That was it. 3 words. They came from the left side of the frame like a draft. It's strange how your body knows where a voice lives in a room, even when you only hear it through built-in speakers. I replayed the line with headphones. I replayed the line on monitors. The voice stayed left, every time. That means the sound wasn't in effect in post. It means the mic pulled it off a wall and didn't have time to center it. I work better when the air's clean, so I drove out there midweek when most people are inside under lights. The road along the river still had the old rail bed pressed into its shoulder. Every mile or so there was a gap in the trees where a siding used to run. I parked at a turnout that had a broken picnic table and a barrel with no bottom. The factory sat across a narrow span of iron and rivets that carried a pipe in the old days. I don't weigh much compared to the ore they used to move, but I still held the handrail like it could tell me if the load was too much. The yard was a field of fallen teeth. Roofs broke and stayed where they landed. Windows gave up and became black squares. The only thing close to tidy was a line of pallets that someone brought in recent years to deal with copper theft. There was no guard trailer, no fresh tape, no cameras. Maybe whoever owns it ran the numbers and decided to let the fence do all the work a fence can do by itself, which isn't much. I went in through a doorway that forgot it was supposed to be a wall. The first building had a floor like rippled ice. Oil and dust can make a skin over time. My boots scuffed the surface and left tracks that looked like they belonged to a heavier man. Overhead, a belt hung between rollers that still showed a shine where the world rubbed them. I clicked my light and kept it low. It's easier to see distance if you keep the beam near your feet. On the far end, a catwalk led to a room with glass on 3 sides. The foreman used to stand there and look down at men who stood there and looked up. That arrangement leaves marks in the air even after everyone goes home. There were signs that people had come through and tried to be brave. Spray paint and bubble letters. A green bottle that held 2 kinds of rainwater. Moth wings in a ring on a workbench like someone had counted and then stopped at a number that felt unlucky. I reached the line of rollers and stared along the run like it could give me a straight thought. The belts were still face down on the rollers. I reached out to touch the edge of one because I wanted to know if it was tacky or dry. My fingers came back gray. I rubbed them together and watched the dust go up in a little cloud. That's when I heard the first sound. It didn't come from a machine. It came from the room. Anyone who's worked in a place with heavy gear knows the idle sounds a shop makes when nobody's doing anything. The ticks and pings and small slumps as metal remembers that it used to be hot. This wasn't that. This was the first half of a breath taken by something tall. It moved through the run like a shrug. My light picked up motes that rode the push and then settled out of the air. I don't run from rooms unless the room asks me to run. This one didn't. It felt like a place that had been left in the middle of a sentence. If you speak in a space like that, you change the end of the sentence. I stayed quiet and kept moving. The second building sat lower. That's where the big work happened. A blast furnace leaves a shape in the world that doesn't go away. Even cold, it reads as heat in your head. The floor squatted under it in a way that said nobody trusted the load and everybody kept it anyway. A row of forges stood along one wall with their mouths open. This is where that line from the video lived. This is where the camera caught a glow that didn't belong. I stared into the nearest firebox and saw rust flowers and a family of dead spiders. No glow, no current, no feed. I pulled myself up and looked across the tops where the brickwork stepped down. The bricks were dark and then not. If you live with a stove, you know the way an ember tries to make the air believe it's brighter than it is. This was brighter than that moment. I breathed out and watched the fog of it come back to me. It moved like it hit a fan. There was no fan. I took my phone out because I wanted a lazy record. I don't film for proof anymore. Proof makes people mad. I film so I can watch my hands and remember what they were doing when I tell a story. The screen showed the world with a little extra noise in it. The sensor pulled red where there was none. It pulled yellow where there was none. It told me the forges were shouting at a light my eye couldn't hear yet. I found the control pedestal because it was where the light wanted to go. The board wore worn labels. Start, stop, jog, feed. The buttons were a style you don't see anymore. They give under your finger like a good door latch. I didn't press them. I put my hand near the face and felt for a draft. Heat flows even when you can't name the source. My skin said the board was a shade warmer than the room. That made me think about the substation. No power here didn't have to mean no power within reach. Old plants often kept a boneyard out of sight where replacement parts turned into fossils. Past that, there was usually a wall where the line came in. I left the big room and followed a corridor that ran downhill. It opened into a space where the sound changed. The air got heavy like a storm had walked up and down in there for a while and then decided to come back later. On the far wall, a slate panel held knife switches the size of a forearm. All of them were down. The bus bars wore dust. The lockouts wore tags gone a sick shade of pink, which means someone left them in the sun for a season after the season they were supposed to be used. I leaned close to the metal and listened. People will tell you can't hear current. They haven't put their ear to old work. I didn't hear a hum. I heard a space that wanted to remember a hum and didn't have the strength. The room next to the panel held records, boxes, a desk with drawers that stuck. I worked them until they gave. There was a ledger that belonged to a man who made marks in the tidy way of people who like to be seen as tidy. I followed his figures until the night of the collapse. His hand shook on that page. He still kept the math square. He underlined a number twice. The total weight of men and machines on E-line when the roof went. His underline cut the page a little. The next page had a smudge at the bottom like a thumb waited there and didn't know where to go. I heard the conveyor then. It was far enough away that the sound had to wind through 2 rooms and a shaft full of dark. The rattle climbed the wall behind the desk and crossed the ceiling above me. The belt ran a slow loop. It sped up. It slowed. It coughed. There was no power at the panel behind me. There was no light in the forges. There was no reason for anything to move anywhere. I'm not proud of what I did next. I said a word I only say when I'm alone. It bounced off the file cabinets and came back smaller. I put the ledger down and walked toward the noise. The belt lived in a long brick throat with roll-up doors at both ends. I kept my light on the floor and watched the edge of my beam for movement. You can tell a lot from what dust wants to do. The rollers were turning. The belt moved against them at a pace that would have carried a load from one end to the other without dropping it. I put my hand near the edge and felt air move the hair on my wrist. There was no breath in that. It was the push you get when a thing larger than you doesn't care that you're near it. I followed the run to a feeder that used to drop stock onto the belt. The feeder sat quiet. A hook hung above it on a chain that held the memory of old work. The hook turned once while I watched. Not a full circle. The kind of move you see when someone shifts a weight on the other end of a cable. I wanted the high ground, not in the movie sense, in the sense that I wanted to put my back to a wall and see as much as I could without having to turn. The catwalk above the line felt like the right choice even if it was the wrong one. Stairs that old are always a bet. I put my foot on the first tread and leaned into the rail. It held with a groan that came up through my shoulder. I climbed without letting the steps take all of me. At the top, the foreman's box gave me a view of the whole throat. I set my light on the sill, tilted it to wash the run, and let the rest of the room stay dark. That's when I heard the other voice again. Not the same recording. Not a loop. The same person. The voice wore the same grain. It lived on my left again. The words were different.
Don't talk.
You can call it instinct or caution or fear. I listened. I didn't speak. The belt carried something I couldn't see. The sound it made is a sound I've only heard in one other place: hospitals. When an empty bed rolls, the wheels sing in a way they don't sing under a body. The belt made that same thin song. It reached the end and changed pitch like it wanted me to know the turn was happening. I don't think they were trying to scare me. I think they were busy. I watched the far door. The panel above it still had the old painted letters that told men which section this was when they were new. E. The letter that wrapped its arms around that night and didn't let go. The belt stopped. Dust settled in a way that made a map I didn't know how to read. I picked up my light and moved to the stairs. On the floor again, I followed a line of posts with chipped yellow paint. They ran toward the furnace house. The glow I'd seen as a memory burned a little brighter with each step. Temperature changes don't lie. Your face learns them first. My cheeks felt flushed and my nose tried to decide whether to run. I held my breath and then let it go slow. The explorers had stood in this doorway. I recognized the scrapes where their tripod feet dug into the concrete. They'd framed the fireboxes so the mouths lined up and read like a choir. They'd panned left to right and picked up the belt in the background, doing work for nobody. They'd said the line about not being alone. They'd stepped forward because that's what you do when the room says it doesn't need you and you want to prove you're not listening. The heat bit without raising warning blisters. I could have stood there for an hour and kept my eyebrows. That's worse than a room that wants to hurt you fast. This room wanted to make you forget it could hurt you. I moved along the mouths and watched for the moment when the inside of one looked less dead than the others. There, third from the end. The brickwork had a stripe that didn't match. You get that when someone repairs with a pallet from another plant. The mortar took the light in a way that made it look wet without being wet. I crouched and peered in. Rust moved like something alive when my breath hit it. Under the rust was a skin that didn't belong to this metal. It looked like glass that had changed its mind. Slag does that when it cools too fast. The color underneath the glass didn't belong to either world. Not the red of heat. Not the blue of cold. A kind of old orange that lives in photographs that sat in windows too long. Behind me, a sound started low and wide. I felt it in the bones above my eyes. The forges spoke to each other without words. The belt woke up again and ran in a slow loop. In the wall to my right, something like a breath pulled air through a vent that had a filter on it that no one had changed since Eisenhower. I set my hand on the brick beside the third mouth. It felt like a dog that wanted to sleep. The other voice arrived as if they'd always stood behind me.
Back up.
2 syllables. A soft rasp that carried without trying. I did what they said. A moment later, a seam opened in the slag under the stripe. It didn't crack. It didn't shatter. It parted like a book that knows which page you want. Air moved into the box and came back with a smell that belongs to one moment in a foundry. The moment when the line between metal and stone gets blurry, and everyone pretends they're not watching that line because it scares them. The glow chased itself along the seam, and then went out like it didn't want to work too hard for me. I turned to see the person who'd spoken. My light swept the floor and found boot prints that weren't mine. The dust would have told me if these were old. They weren't. The edges were clean and the middle had settled while I watched. I raised the beam and painted the path the prints wanted me to see. They led to a ladder cut into the wall that went down where the floor didn't admit it had a downstairs. I don't like ladders that come out of holes. I went anyway. Down there, the air turned wet in a way that didn't come from water. It came from time. In the pool of my light, I found the lip of the slag pit. The spill had a shine that looked like the inside of an oyster if the oyster had agreed to be a parking lot. People say you can't see weight. That's wrong. You can see the way a pit pulls a room down around it even when nothing moves. I didn't step on the crust. I knew the stories. Boots that go in and don't come back. Hooks that can't get a purchase because the skin over the top won't let go. I knelt and tapped the edge with the back of my knuckles. The sound came back slow. I couldn't tell how deep it was. I tried to look into the reflection in my light and found the same thing I always find when I look into a surface that wants to be water and isn't. A picture that knows I'm there and refuses to show me me. When the steel ran here, men worked the slag with paddles and bars and long rakes. If you stand very still and listen in a room that remembers that, you can hear the metal trying to tell the old story back to itself. I heard bars, I heard paddles. The scrape changed pitch like the men changed hands. The voice that had told me to back up didn't speak. They didn't have to. They were busy with the same work they'd been given in the middle of the last century. Keep the line moving, clean the waste, make room for the next pour. Don't look at the place where the roof went and took the night shift down with it. I said I'd keep my count on speakers to 2. I meant it. So I won't put the other sounds into mouths. I won't pretend I heard men call out or count or pray. I'll tell you what the room did. The room settled, the belt ran, the forges breathed. The pit held its face still like a lake that worries about scaring the moon. Somewhere above me, a chain kissed a hook and made a small bright noise. I rose and set my palm flat on the wall. The bricks had a little give in them, not the soft of rot, the soft of heat that left its fingerprints and went away. My light found a run of chalk on the wall at my shoulder. A mason had left marks for a job and then not come back to finish. The marks said where to cut and how deep. The cut hadn't been made. The place where the chalk told the blade to go looked like a scar on a thing that had already healed. I took my hand back and felt grit grind across my skin. When I rubbed my thumb across my fingers, I could feel the fine bite of glass dust. That meant someone had been working on something near heat and didn't mind what it did to their lungs. The dust was fresh enough that it made my skin tight. There was a doorway at the far end of the room. The light didn't want to go through. The beam broke and came back to me with less than I sent. Rooms can do that when they want you to keep the rest of the world outside. I walked anyway and kept one hand out to tell me where the edge was. The doorway led into a gallery that ran under the furnace house. Above me, the fireboxes sat like old gods on a shelf. Down here, the ash that fell through the grates made drifts against the walls that kept their shape the way snow keeps its shape when the temperature holds. Someone had dragged something through those drifts. The trail looked like the wake of a small boat. It led to a steel door that lay on its side. The hinges had failed all at once instead of one by one. That's not how doors usually die. They complain for years and then give. This one took its secrets with it until it didn't. Behind the door, the room was short and long. The ceiling sat close to my head. On the back wall, a rectangle showed where a sign had been. The screws still sat in the holes. The paint behind the rectangle was a better color than the paint around it. I traced the outline with my light and tried to see the ghost of the letters. I didn't need them. I knew what rooms like that are for. When you work with heat, you need a place to stand when the heat makes up its mind to do something new. The refuge room still had a bench along one side. A dent in the wood said a heavy man used to sit there and take the 5 minutes he could get. A locker door leaned open. Someone had written a first name on the inside with pencil and then burned over it with a lighter to set the graphite. The flame had crawled and left a wolf-shaped stain at the edge. The name wasn't mine. The wall opposite the bench had windows that looked into a space that didn't exist anymore. The glass had gone to powder at the base. The frames were empty. Through them I saw darkness that wasn't a room. The ground had fallen away from the foundation. The factory had been eating itself, slow and patient. I felt the urge to step through one of the frames and look down into whatever was down there. That's the kind of urge that puts you in newspapers. I stood still until it passed. When I came back through the gallery, the belt sound had moved out of the throat and into the main hall. It had a new rhythm now, not a conveyor rhythm, a carry rhythm. I followed the beat until I stood beside a run that led toward the loading floor. There, a motor housing the size of a bathtub crept along an overhead track without a motor in it. The trolley moved the way a dog moves in its sleep when it chases something it wants more than anything. It had no current. It had no chain fall engaged. It moved because the building remembered that route and didn't know how to stop remembering. I knew what had to come next because the video cut there and because the file I'd read in the office upstairs said where the line would go if the line could go anywhere it wanted without a man to guide it. The trolley would take the housing to the furnace mouth. A crane that didn't exist anymore would lower it into place. A crew that didn't exist anymore would bolt it up. The foreman would nod. Shift would change. Someone would open the tap and watch the first run of the night. I didn't want to see the rest of that shadow shift. I wanted to understand it. That's not the same as wanting to be there when weight moves. I went back to the control board in the furnace house. I put my palm over the space where the main contactor lived. It felt warmer now. I looked at the backside of the board through a panel the size of a book cover. The cavity held nothing living, only wire that had turned the color of cooked sugar. I put my ear to the metal and listened. The room answered, not with current, with air. The forges were breathing in through broken brick and out through seams that had no right to carry a draft. If breath had weight, it would have knocked me back. I thought about the pit. I thought about the men under the crust. I thought about the kind of work that goes on after the pay stops. The world runs on that work more than anyone likes to admit. We tell ourselves a shift is 8 hours or 10. We tell ourselves a night ends when the whistle says it does. This place didn't listen to whistles anymore. I saw movement on the far side of the room. Not a person. The suggestion of a person in the way metal sways when weight shifts on bolts that are still brave. I felt my mouth go dry in that stupid way bodies have of trying to be clever with chemistry. I reached for the only thing in reach that felt like it belonged to me. My name. I said it under my breath to know I was still in there. The room didn't care what I called myself. The room had its own list. The other voice returned. Close this time. Near my left shoulder, like a friend who knows you but doesn't know if you'll listen.
We're not alone.
Same line as the clip. Same shape to the words. The same quiet that carries better than a shout. I turned by inches and lifted the light. There was no one to put the light on. There were marks in the dust that made sense of the footprints I'd seen. A person had stood there not long ago. A person my size. Maybe less. They'd turned to face the room and then stepped backward twice. They'd left a heel print on top of one toe print, like they forgot which way they meant to go. Then nothing. No drag. No scuff. No place where a soul slipped and caught itself. I don't like when the edges of a story try to live inside my skin, so I moved. I picked a route that took me past the places I needed to say a physical goodbye to. The belt. The forges. The throat with the letter E over the door. The ladder down into the room with the pit where the air felt heavy with old promises. The substation that had no hum and still told lies with heat. When I reached the yard, the wind changing felt like a hand taking its time on the back of my neck. The sky had gone the color it goes right before a storm waddles in and tries to pretend it was light all along. I crossed the pipe span and kept my eyes where my feet needed them. The river flicked a little spray up through the grate in one place where the current found a lip. It sounded like a laugh out of breath. I thought I was done. I thought I'd go home and make a pot of something and think about the way old work refuses to die. I thought I'd cut the clip into a timeline with the county minutes and the ledger pages. I'd put the sound of the belt into the file so anyone with ears could hear the loop. I'd point at the slag and call it what it is. A grave. The law can pretend it isn't. The law can write force majeure and sign 6 times. The pit doesn't forget who's under it. I made it to the car. I put both hands on the roof and breathed. The metal felt warm in a way that didn't belong to the day. I looked over the dash at the road while the wind pushed little sticks across the gravel. I put the key in the ignition and didn't turn it. The phone on the passenger seat woke up on its own. That's not a lyric line. I didn't touch it. The screen came on. A clip opened. The video wasn't mine. It wore the same jitter that comes from a handheld around old iron. The same left side whisper lived in the first seconds.
Don't talk.
The camera panned across the furnace mouths. It landed on the third from the end, the stripe in the brickwork. The seam moved in the way I'd just seen it move. My breath fogged a window that wasn't a window. Then the frame shook like someone tried to pocket the phone and failed. The audio flattened. The low metal groan that cut the original clip rolled through the speakers. My car felt smaller while it played. The clip didn't end at the cut I knew. It held on. The last second showed a shape in the reflection on the slag that didn't move like a person. I reached for the phone and caught myself on the edge of a stupid thought. That reaching would let whatever was inside the clip reach back. I let the thought pass through me the way you let a drunk pass on a narrow sidewalk. The clip ended by itself. The screen went dark. The phone gave me back a black square that showed me just enough of my face to make me want to look away. I drove home with the radio off because I didn't want any sound arguing with the sound I brought with me. I slept with the window cracked because stale air makes old places worse. In the morning I made coffee and sat at the table with the papers. I don't keep a board with string on it. I use the table and make piles. The ledger went over here, the minutes over there. The union sheets in the middle because they tell the truth between the lines. The death notices from the year of the collapse made a stack that leaned without falling. I read names until the names stopped feeling like names and settled into a single heavy word the size of the room under the furnace. I let them sit in my chest and tried not to rearrange them to make myself feel better about who got missed. I called the county recorder and asked for a map that wouldn't live in a browser. The woman on the other end sounded like she'd swallowed a handful of dry marbles and learned to work with it. She said the parcel maps were thin where the river did its worst work. She said if I wanted a better sense of the bones under Harrowgate, I should ask for a survey done for the rail line before they pulled the spurs. I asked. She sent it. The surveyor drew neat lines that empathized with steel. His pen loved angles. I followed his hatched marks across the page to the place where the slag pit lived and stopped. The hatch changed its pattern. The legend said the new shading meant unstable fill. He drew it as a warning for men who ran machines. Don't put weight here unless you mean to lose it. His hatch left a little circle in the middle of the shaded field. That's a mark surveyors use when they want to hold a point still while the world moves around it. The number by the circle matched the elevation of the main floor. That meant the pit had a lip that sat where a man could reach it without bending. It meant the crust started at the old walking height. I put the paper flat and set a glass in the corner to hold it. The light through the window lined up with the hatch and turned the field into a flicker that looked like heat. I stood there and watched it until the sun moved away and the hatch went back to being ink. The next day I drove back with a recorder because I'm an optimist in ways that embarrass me. The first building had lost more glass overnight without help. The yard had new tracks that didn't belong to me. The pipe span whined under less weight than the day before. The wind smelled like a storm took a bite out of something old and chewed with its mouth open. I didn't bring a tripod. I wanted my hands. I didn't bring a thermal camera because I didn't want to pretend I'd know what its rainbow meant. I brought paper and a pencil and a habit of counting when I get scared. The habit's old. I used to count steps between doorways when I had to take certain hallways at night. Today I counted breaths between sounds. 1. The belt. 2. The chain. 3. The forges. 4 didn't belong to yesterday. 4 lived under the floor. It had a slow swing like a pendulum that didn't want to be seen. It ticked the edges of the room and made dust fall in long strings from cables that had no work to do anymore. I followed the swing to a column that held up a beam that held up the place with the foreman's glass box. The column had a number chalked on it in a hand that matched the hand in the refuge room. The line under the number put its weight forward like it wanted to keep the digit from falling on its face. There are people who'd tell you to get out of a place like that and never look back. I don't disagree with them. I stayed anyway. At midday, the river found its voice and pushed it through every hole in the skin of the buildings. The ironworks answered without words. The belt kept its loop. The trolley made its sleepwalk. The forges opened and closed the seam under the stripe like they were breathing for someone who couldn't breathe for himself. The pit held the light like a mouth holds a secret that got too big to swallow. The other voice spoke once.
You shouldn't be here.
They were right. I was past the line where curiosity helps anyone. I was in the part of the story where people make mistakes because they want to see if the rules will bend for them. I backed away from the pit and left the ladder 2 rungs at a time. I told the room thank you without moving my lips. I put my hand on the E over the throat and felt the letter hum back at me in the low pitch of heavy metal that doesn't need music. In the yard, the weather made its decision. The first drop hit the back of my neck and ran down between my shoulder blades like a finger. The rain came hard after that. The sound of it on the sheet metal roofs pushed the ironworks music down into a pocket. The river ran loud enough that it took the voice out of the belt. I crossed the pipe span with both hands on the rail and kept my weight centered over the line that didn't sag. On the road, I looked back once. I should tell you I saw a light and a mouth or a figure in a window. I didn't. I saw a complex of buildings giving the rain back to the sky an inch at a time. I saw a ruin that didn't care that I could name it. I drove until the road rose out of the river's breath and the air turned clean. That night, I set the recorder on the table and listened to the hours while I washed dishes and kept an eye on the window. The belt lived in the file with my breath and the scratch of my sleeve. The chain kissed itself on a regular beat that didn't match my heart. The forges took air and returned it on a schedule. The pit kept its silence like the best liar in any room. When the clip reached the part where the other voice told me not to talk, the hair on my arms did the thing it does when something in the room moves without the room admitting it. I didn't tape over the old men with a new story. I won't. If a county with a better budget than ours wants to make it right, they can bring a real crew and a real rig and do what the law says you do when the ground hides the dead. They won't. They'll write another phrase that lets them sleep. Acts of God. Unrecoverable. Unsafe to attempt. There's a kind of safety we love too much. The kind that keeps our hands clean while the hardest work keeps getting done by whoever can't stop doing it. I went back once more, near dusk. The sky held that gray that comes on fast and leaves slower than you hope. I brought a coil of line without knowing what I planned to tie. I brought chalk because I wanted to put a mark on the wall and see if the room would let it stay. The yard was quiet in the way a throat's quiet when it waits for a word. I crossed and went to the refuge room first. I wrote one name from the stack slow on the bench where a heavy man used to sit. I said it out loud and didn't ask for anything. I wrote another. I wrote until the chalk wanted to break in my fingers, and then I put the stub in the locker with the wolf stain. When I came out into the gallery, the swing had changed sides. The pendulum noise touched the other edge of the room and sent a little fall of ash that kept its shape all the way to the floor. I watched until I believed it, which took a while. In the furnace house, I set the coil down and stood with my hands open. I thought about tying a line around my waist and dropping the other end to the pit so the room could tell me if I was about to be stupid. Then I pictured the line tightening as if someone on the other side wanted to keep me. I left the rope where it was. The voice spoke for the last time while I watched the striped seam draw and open like a slow blink.
It's time.
I didn't ask what for. I understood enough. I stepped back out of the throat and let the letter over the door pass over my head like a weather front. I walked the line of posts with chipped paint and put distance between me and the breath. In the yard, the sky finally lost patience and gave the valley some real dark. I gained it to the pipe span and put my hand to the rail. The iron had the same steady warmth as a palm. The river moved under my feet with a promise it's kept longer than men build and longer than men grieve. On the far side, the road waited. When tires rolled on the gravel, they made a sound like a memory trying to make itself new. I didn't bring you a monster with teeth. I didn't bring you a face. I brought you work that doesn't stop and the proof that some rooms remember the way a job gets done until time runs out again. The explorers who whispered about the glow weren't wrong. The glow lives there. It shows itself when the room needs to see its own hands. The cut to their feed isn't a trick in the software. It's what happens when the building draws breath long enough and deep enough to drown the sound of new voices and remind itself which voices it chooses to keep. If you go, and I'm not telling you to go, you'll think you can keep the speaker count low. You'll think you can step in and step out without changing anything. You'll stand in the doorway and frame the mouths and watch the belt and hear the first stroke of a press that has nothing to hit. You'll forget to breathe until the room does it for you. You'll leave with dust under your nails that belongs to men who didn't get the endings they were promised. You'll sleep and wake up to a clip that opens by itself and shows you the same 3 words placed on your left like a hand on your shoulder. We're not alone. You'll want to answer. Don't. The room knows the rest.